Hi everyone, thanks for dropping by and for returning to the old world. Today we're talking about taking your favourite roleplay game characters from the dungeon to the battlefield. Now, when I was younger and with more time on my hands but no real income, my friends and I would meet regularly for some quite long roleplay sessions. We used quite a range of systems. Big Eye Small Mouth was one of them, for example, but generally we used a version of the Warhammer roleplay rules, but albeit lots of house rules involved. Magic, for example, worked completely differently to the book you see before you. As time went on, the characters we were using started to develop their own personalities. Now, obviously they didn't, but they went from being stats on a piece of paper to a position where, as players, we could draw on previous adventures and previous sessions to think, what would my character do in these circumstances? And to start to build them as realistic as you get in a fantasy system, but realistic characters with their own drive and determination. Years later, some of these characters would go on to become the leaders and heroes in my tabletop armies. Now, Games Workshop did release some rules many years ago in White Dwarf, looking at creating characters for Warhammer. I think it was around transferring your Warhammer quest figures and characters into something that you can use on the battlefield. So there was lots of rules floating around with that, but I don't actually think you need to go that far, and you can just use standard core rules for these figures. Just think about what items you're giving them, how does that best fit with what the characters have. But why do you only need to use the standard rules? Well, using a roleplay character gives you immediate theme. What forces would they be able to command? Well, through the experiences you've had in your roleplay sessions, you already know whether they would be a rabble rouser with a mass of peasants following them, whether they'd hire some hard-bitten mercenaries, or whether, as a character, they've elevated themselves socially to a position where they might even have their own retinue, in which case, well, how much money have they got? What kind of troops could they afford to keep in that retinue? All of this really provides some colour and a reason to an army, with actually a lot of the imagining how it would be work being done for you. You've already done the sessions. Characters have, air quotes, lived certain experiences, and that's what you're drawing on to create this army. Now, another bonus of using your roleplay characters in this way is that when you no longer have the time for a long, drawn-out roleplay session, particularly if you were the games master and looking to write your own adventures as you went on, then your characters can live on and develop their stories further. Even if it's just in the occasional casual pickup game when you can get a couple of hours in with a regular or irregular opponent. Let me give you an example, and that is the story of Thorgrim Thorgrimsson. Now, for those of you thinking that name sounds familiar from my Collecting Dwarf Army series, then absolutely yes, there's a reason for that. The Jarl of my dwarf army, Thorgrim Leifson, is imagined as an ancestor of Thorgrim Thorgrimsson. Now, at the start of the roleplay adventure, Thorgrimsson, that is, was quite young by dwarf standards, and he was by that point not particularly high ranking in his hold. A couple of generations on, younger sons, things like that. So distantly related to Thorgrim. Leifs and Thorgrim just floating through as a family name. But I digress. So, Thorgrim Thorgrimsson at the start had just lost his hold to a foreign attack, not being there at the time. He decided, rather than shaving his head, he would do something a little bit more practical, and he took an oath to establish a new home for his clan. He fell in with a band of adventurers and went about restoring the honour of his name. Eventually, poor old Thorgrimsson would face a Medusa type character, a Gorgon, and whilst the beast was slain, Thorgrim was partially paralysed. One of his legs turned to stone. This rather put a dampener on his ability to operate as an adventurer. Now, a couple of sessions, maybe slightly more later, the band he was part of cleared out an old abandoned fort. Slightly off the beaten track, but in a reasonable location and intact enough that with a bit of dwarven ingenuity, it could be rebuilt. Thorgrimsson took the decision to retire from the adventuring way of life and laid claim to the fort. And that's how his story ended, as far as I was concerned at the time. But then I started playing Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and my first proper army on my return to the game, having played it as a very small child, incorrectly, generally, using other stuff, my first proper army was a dwarf force. And I was taken by the dwarf lord with shield bearers, the figure that you see before him, really good, nice centerpiece model for the army. And it just so happened that I thought, that really fits Thorgrim Thorgrimsson. And it continues his story. A dwarf lord, crippled, paralysed with one leg turned to stone. The only way that he can lead his forces into battle is carried there atop a shield borne by two of his most trusted warriors. And the rest was history. The idea allowed me to take forward my dwarf force, which expanded. This was 7th ed sort of time, 6th into 7th. And the dwarves suffered a lot of reverses as I learned the game, but lots of fun was had, particularly because I had, as well as I've mentioned before, this centerpiece character, not just the model, but the character, driving my own individual narrative forward for this particular format. So that's it really from me. Just some of the reasons why I would heartily recommend taking forward your roleplay characters, getting them on the tabletop, continuing to use them in a different way. Have you got any good RPG stories? Any of your characters that have dragged themselves from the dungeons of the adventuring life to commanding vast armies? Maybe they just commanded a small force. Maybe they took on the leadership of your Mordheim skirmish warband. Who knows? Let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you very much for dropping by. This is Return to the Old World. Have a great day.